Cramer. So please welcome.
Cool. Can everybody hear me okay? Sounds like it. Awesome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Sentry today. So my name is David Cramer. I'm the founder, CEO. I do a lot of things, I guess, at this point of Sentry. I'm sort of a software engineer, but now I just sit in meetings and stuff all day. But I'm also really big in open source. So if you're part of the Django community, you probably use a bunch of my code. Sentry's also totally open source. It's kind of the TLDR of me. How many of you use Sentry today? Know what Sentry is? Oh, okay. This will be interesting. Cool. So Sentry basically it tracks issues in your code. So if there's an error, a crash, or unhandled exception, it kind of depends on the language. We sort of collect that data and tell you about it, and we do a lot of like analytics around it. So we have two goals. It's to make you aware of problems and then to sort of give you all the information to know what's wrong. So if you contrast it with log files, you'll have a stack trace. But for example, we'll give you the stack trace. We'll also tell you literally every variable that's been assigned and what the value is of it. We'll tell you the web requests, the servers, the devices, all this other information. And it's also totally cross-platform. So it's in Python, but it's also in JavaScript and on mobile and everything else. But cool, so what I'm going to talk about is sort of the story of Sentry, both the open source project and then the business, which came later, and sort of how that happened and kind of what we learned and took away from that. So Sentry is, I think, 8-ish years old now, and it's got a pretty simple origin story. I think it's a lot similar to many open source projects. If you've ever built something, it's I don't know, something's going on, you need to solve a problem, so you build something, you release it on GitHub or something like that. So Sentry is pretty similar. There used to be this IRC channel. Does everybody know what IRC is, by the way? I realize this is the Slack generation now. There's this IRC channel called Django users, and it's just like a mailing list. A lot of people would hang out there early days Django, and they'd ask questions, and some people like me would answer them. I have no idea why. It's just that's what happened. And one day, just a normal day, somebody asked how they would within Django take exceptions and log them to the database. And this sort of piqued my interest because I'm why would you do that? You have log files somewhere on the disk. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And they're well, I could see it in the web UI, and I'm okay, that sort of makes sense. And oh, and also I could have all of them from all the servers in one place. And so I'm of course oh yeah, it's really easy. Let me whip up an example. And what that turned into was, it's a little bit more code than this, but something very, very basic. I think it was the first version of this was 50 lines of code or something. Django made it super easy. It's just when there's an exception, create a row stored in the database. And then you would open up the Django admin and you would see it in there. And very, very straightforward. But this was kind of the humble beginnings of Sentry, which was actually called Django DB log at the time. It's a very clever name, very descriptive. And we kind of took that and we sort of built on it. And this evolved over time, but it was it was very simple. I actually did the stats. I think the first version was 60 lines of code, and I think the current version is 250,000 lines of code, to give you an idea of how things change. This is also way back when, so for those of you who don't know IRC, I assume you also don't know what Google Code is. This is we'll call it GitHub v0. So built this project, pushed it up to Google Code, eventually moved it to GitHub. But then this is where I actually think this might be one of my first real big open source projects that people actually used. And it was interesting because if you've ever maintained or built an open source library, what it translates to is you push some stuff up, it's pretty interesting, some other people like it, and then they harass you about fixing things and feature requests and everything under the sun. Every so often somebody will help you fix something or build a feature, but mostly they just ask for things. However, that's kind of empowering. So for us, it was oh, everybody wants all these features, right? You want something and you want something. And so for me, one of the big empowering things of the internet was you could build something and give it to people and they would be very happy about it. And you could do it instantaneously. So releasing open source is kind of the same idea. I'm solving a problem that many others have and they're interested in it and they may or may not want to contribute, but at least I get the satisfaction that they're going to be using the project. Which is why many open source maintainers are willing to just say oh, you want something, I'll build it for you, versus I forget what the saying is, pull requests accepted. versus asking you to build it for them. So that was kind of a process over a few years. Started as Django DB log, kind of evolved into a couple other projects. First was Django Sentry. So 2008, it was a long time ago. Then we created Django Sentry out of that, which was effectively the same thing, just with a shinier UI. It was still just like a Django extension. Like you would drop it in, if you're familiar with Django, you drop it in what's called installed applications, and it was just kind of done from there, which also meant it only worked with Django. And then from there, I actually think Sentry was exactly the same. We just changed the name because putting Django in front of it wasn't cool anymore. But the big gist is it was like this iterative cycle. So these are just like one of our dozen UI refactors over the course of time. But it was always like, how do we iterate and evolve on this idea, and how do we make it do more? How do we sort of satisfy like what people are interested in? And I think it was interesting because like there was no ambition or like big dreams or anything behind this project. It's just like we wanted to make it better. We were using it ourselves, and a lot of other like people in like the Python ecosystem especially were using it. As part of that, like as I mentioned, we started out with Django, right? Like it was a Django extension, it dropped into Django, and it captured Django errors, and that's all it did at the end of the day. And then we saw, so for us, I was at Discuss at the time, which is, it's a company that basically does like comments on the internet. So if you would go to like CNN or something, there's a little comment widget at the bottom, and that's basically all Discuss does. But they were a big Django application, and all we did was Django. We didn't use like pylons. I forget if Flask even existed at the time. So we were just solving our needs. But then like there were other companies they were mostly Django, but they also had some Python projects. And they're like, oh, like it would be nice if it worked for more than just Django. And this is going back to the same thing, like the satisfaction of kind of building something that other people want to use. So of course what we did is we made it work with then like generic Python. And then those same people, like I think one, for example, went to Opscode, which builds Chef, which is like a configuration management software. And another one was working at Mozilla, and they're like, oh, like this is pretty cool. It works well for Python applications. Like, what about other languages? So then they built like a Ruby and a JavaScript binding. And this is kind of like the humble beginnings of what like the Sentry open source community and project became. And that kind of expanded from there, and like there's like dozens of platforms supported at this point. But like the important thing is like all of these were built by the open source community. And that's not necessarily true today. Like for example, Armin, who's going to talk later, is basically in charge of iOS now. I do PHP for some reason. I don't even know why. But like it all started in the open source community, which was a big deal for us. And we like to think of it like there's different ways open source projects are structured. So if you look at something like Python, like if you submit an idea for Python, like you're going to have to get Guido to be on board with you. At the end of the day, it's like a singular decision maker. That's kind of like us for Sentry versus I don't know, the Apache project or even Django, where there's more of like a foundation and a community that decides and sort of builds this stuff, but it's like, it's got a less kind of dictatorship direction around it, so you have to sort of get everybody on the same page, get around the round table and get everybody to agree, whereas Sentry, we're just like, okay, let's build this thing, and everybody else saw value in it, so they contributed in their own way. In their own way, that was like supporting it through like all of these integrations, the languages. It was things like adding support for Jira or something. Kind of like these ecosystems that we didn't really use ourselves, but everybody else found value in. But if we kind of look at like the Sentry service, this is from 2013, so it's a few years old, but it doesn't look that much different today. Top 4 committers. The sad part of this is that like 3 of them worked at Discuss, so you can't really call that anything related to an open source community because we were all just building this for ourselves. And then the worst part is like almost all of the code was written by me. And I think if you look at it today, it's probably still like 95% or at least like above 90. But again, like the big thing here was like this is fine for us. We wanted like a singular direction with the project. And to be honest, it's like really complicated. Nobody can figure it out anyways. But the important thing was like the open source community contributed all this stuff that we didn't have the expertise or knowledge to build. And that, again, it started with the language platforms, but it's kind of evolved from there. And we've actually like internally today, like we still have like all of these languages, and they were all originally built by the open source community. And some of them now we actually just have taken over like kind of maintainership over, but it's like interesting because as soon as we sort of take ownership of the project, give an example, like the PHP SDK. Somebody originally wrote it, and then I took ownership of it, and literally nobody ever contributes again versus we have the .NET SDK is actually still managed by the open source community. And there's just a ton of people that contribute to it. And it's like this interesting dilemma of like, what do you leave up to the open source ecosystem versus like, what do you like bring into like the core team, which, you know, our core team is also our business. But the important element of this is like it created a lot of traction, and like traction leads to a lot of opportunities. And most importantly, the traction only existed because it was open source. Like we sort of, you know, went into this like unambitiously, and it's like, okay, like this is cool. We want to build this, and we want to solve our problems, sort of solve some other people's problems. But I think the only reason we've gotten to where we are is because it was open source, which is super, super important for us. Fast forward, I guess a year later, according to my timeline, and we built Sentry.io, which used to be GetSentry.com. And this was basically our like SaaS service. This is when we're like, okay, there's something here. It's kind of interesting. Like, what should we do with it? And it all started, I think I was getting drinks with somebody that works at HEROKU, and they're like, hey, like, you know, a lot of people seem to use Sentry. Have you ever thought about like building a HEROKU add-on out of it? And I'm like, why would I do that? Like, what's it gonna, like, how's that change anything? And their answer was like, well, you know, like instead of me paying for these beers, like maybe you could. So it was like very unambitious. It's like, okay, we can build this little thing, make a little bit of money on the side, and that'll be cool. But we were still fully employed at other companies at the time when we did this. And I think the interesting part of this was when we started, you know, it's completely bootstrapped. One of the goals was don't spend money on the project. Like, if you've ever tried to build a side project and you have to spend your own money to like keep it online and stuff, eventually you're like, you know, I'd rather have this money and spend it on something else. So like when we did it, especially because HEROKU sort of conned us into this add-on thing, we were able to start with just their platform, and they were very generous in that they helped us get up and running very quickly. They helped us get on the marketplace very quickly. And most importantly, they actually covered server costs at the beginning of the project, as we hosted 100% of the platform on their service. But HEROKU being kind of this closed-ish ecosystem, and not everybody uses HEROKU, we're kind of sitting there like, oh, this is kind of cool. People seem super interested. Maybe there's something here. But not everybody's using HEROKU, and they're sort of mad that they can't pay us money. And so I think in the time it took for HEROKU to take us from what they call the beta phase to like the launch phase of our add-on, we were able to implement Stripe, which I don't know if Stripe is everywhere in like Europe and stuff yet, but like it was unbelievably easy to get off the ground with it. And so like I think in a matter of weeks we went from like open source project to like, oh yeah, here's a sort of SaaS with HEROKU marketplace and Stripe support, and then we were able to start collecting money. However, so at the time, like, you know, we have like sort of these money channels. We're not really making much money, and HEROKU's still footing the bill. We had a lot of issues with this. So the biggest issues with doing a side project are always like what do you work on, and like how do you prioritize things, especially because you probably have a full-time job. And for us, there were a lot of issues with HEROKU. If you've ever used it, like Python takes a lot of memory, and HEROKU didn't give you a lot of memory on their VMs. So Sentry would just like die all the time, and no matter how many dynos we spun up, it didn't help anything. So at this point, the last piece of our foundational infrastructure was a company called SoftLayer, which is a US company owned by IBM, and they rent servers just like Rackspace or anybody else. And they actually also gave us a bunch of free money to like sort of move to their platform. And I think for the first 12 months of the SaaS service, we didn't pay a dime for any hosting costs. And this was like hugely powerful because like it meant like we had real hardware, so we no longer had these issues. We had to put a little bit of work into it to make it work, but like it was still very cheap for us to run, which meant we could keep providing it. It meant we could like keep building things. But we still had this issue of like, where do we spend time versus where do we spend money? So it's a bootstrap project. Costs a lot of money to do a lot of things in businesses, especially when you're like using all these SaaS services and renting servers and not really paying attention because you have another job to do. So, for example, when we switched to SoftLayer, we had to spend a lot of time spinning up chef scripts to make the servers run effectively. And that was a trade-off of like, we couldn't really afford, say, something like HEROKU that was more easy to scale, and we were willing to invest the time because we couldn't afford it to set up these scripts. And that actually paid off. Like, we're still on the same infrastructure, I don't know, 5 years later or something. But the biggest issue with this is like the time aspect was not getting any better. At the time, is like myself and my eventual co-founder, Chris, who's a designer, we were both employed at Discuss. And I think roughly a year before we left discuss was when we built the SaaS. And at this point we're like, there's something here. We're spending a lot of time on this, but we'd like to spend more. And so what we decided to do was not spend more time and go get different jobs that were just as demanding. I went to Dropbox and my co-founder went to GitHub, and we did this for the next 2 years. And during that time, it's arguably worse than before. Like, Discuss was kind of in a settled place, but like both Dropbox and GitHub are like these kind of up and coming establishments that are growing pretty fast, and like no matter what anybody tells you are like the true startups where they're absolutely demanding of your time and like very stressful. So what this meant is like Sentry's sort of slowly growing, there's more customers, and then like nights and weekends, basically all the time, we're sitting here supporting those customers. And what that means is we're supporting the customers instead of building software. And that would be like, I would go home and I would go answer a bunch of support tickets, and I'd be like, I'm done working for the day. I don't want to build anything. And then like on the weekends, maybe like once a month, I would build a new feature. And so it was like very slow, and it was like kind of frustrating, because if you go back to like, why would you start in like this open source thing? It's because you wanted to build something, and now we're not really building anything. We're just like supporting it. And it kind of messed up the whole like ideals. So we did that for roughly 2 years. And then this was 2 years ago today in January. We're like, okay, like enough is enough. This is demanding. We've got a bunch of customers. We were actually profitable at this point, to the point where we could actually pay our own salaries. And I think we actually had enough to maybe hire 1 or 2 people. But it was still like a risky thing. Like, it's like, okay, do we quit our jobs? Do we do this full time? Like, what do we really want to do? And so what we decided to do was not only quit our jobs, but then like go make a deal with the devil, very good devils, and we raised a bunch of money. So classic Silicon Valley, we raised 2 rounds of fundraising, a little over $10 million. And it was interesting for us because we did it like, we're a profitable company, not like big or anything, like, profitable at a small size is relative. It's pretty easy to achieve. We're also open source. So like these 2 things are actually a little bit scary to VCs. So it's a very interesting process. I'm not going to talk much about it. Feel free to ask me afterwards if you're curious. But we went into this and we said like, okay, like we're making the decision, we're going full time, and let's like see what we can build this into. And there were a lot of reasons why we went down this route. Like many people will be like, why would you raise money? Like, why would you raise money if you're profitable? And the biggest one is unquestionably competition. So by the time we decided to work on this full time, there's probably dozens of companies that are like, oh, this is a good idea, we should build it too. And they're companies that aren't actually like engineering organizations. They're like companies that are like, oh, we could build this idea and then put a sales team and a marketing team behind it, and then we'll like make a bunch of money. And being engineers and being highly competitive, we're kind of like, that's not fair. Like, we spent a lot of time building this because we truly wanted to solve this problem, and now we've got a bunch of companies coming in, especially venture-backed ones, that are trying to like just kind of like take our lunch. And the unfortunate truth is you can't compete with VC companies without VC money, because they can just outgrow you in a heartbeat. So that was reason number 1. Reason number 2, which is not necessarily needed, is additional capital allows you to like grow faster, right? So like we're actually doing really well. Like throughout Sentry's history, like we maintained adoption, we grew adoption, but it was, like you can imagine this gray line is like what a bootstrapped company might look like. It's very hard to accelerate that, especially when you're an engineering organization. So taking money, the idea is like we're going to spend a lot of money up front on hiring, on sales and marketing, which we don't really do, and then we're going to see an exponential return. So if you imagine you chart this out, like, I don't know, at the end of this, we're like Microsoft or something, versus, I don't know what a small company is anymore. But this allowed us to do a lot ahead of where we were as a company, and it allowed us to like maintain our foothold. It allowed us to keep building things the way we wanted, which was the open source way, and allowed us to hire. So I think right around the time we raised money, we had just hired Armin. So it was the 3rd person on the team. And everybody else at this point, like all of our competitors, had like 5 to 10, usually closer to 10 people within their organization. But they were all sales. There were very few engineers. So what we did with all this money is we hired another 20 people, 19 people being engineers. And we basically said, like, you know what, we're going to keep doing what we're doing well. And that's building this open source platform that like solves this problem, solves it really well, and we're going to do it to the best of our ability. And now we're slowly growing out of this phase of the company where we're building out like go-to-market. I still don't know what that means. But people that make us actually money versus us just kind of giving away everything for free. But when we talk a lot about this, people are always concerned. They're like, oh, you raised money. Like, what's going to happen to open source? And I think this is interesting because, like, I have a strong view of the world that, like, open source, not only is it here to stay, but, like, certain technologies must be open source going forward. Like developer tooling and monitoring and infrastructure, you're not going to use proprietary systems anymore. It's just a thing of the past. So when we talk about, like, well, what about the open source at Sentry? Like, what we actually want to talk about is, like our goal is just that everybody should be able to use it. And what that means is you should be able to use it by paying us if you want to. You should be able to use it by running yourself. And this is, like, fundamental to what open source means. Like, it's the freedom to choose whatever software you want in your organization, and to choose the software for the right reasons. And the way we've approached this is we have a cloud service, which is Sentry.io, and we have on-premise. I realize that a lot of people like to spell this word with an S on the end, but we're sticking with this. And we've actually seen that, like, this very interesting dynamic where a lot of companies will use the open source behind the firewall on-premise. They don't pay us a dime most of the time. Those companies are like Uber and Stripe and Square. But they use it mostly because it's very easy for them to bring into their organization. They don't really have to go through sales channels or anything. So it's very, again, like, freedom of choice. It doesn't mean they're opposed to paying for it. It's just like they're like, oh, we just want to, like, get this running on our servers. But then an equal number of, like, very large organizations like Postmates and Dropbox and Twitter, they actually use our SaaS service and they're totally happy with it. And this was, like, the interesting learnings for us. It's like we kind of assumed big companies, they just wanted, like, traditional software for a while, which is like, oh, we need, like, security, we need to run it, it has to be on our servers. But that's, like, been far from the truth. And, like, if you imagine, like, the on-premise model is like the old traditional open source model. It's like, I don't know if Hans is in here, but it's Elasticsearch. It's where we're going to build Elasticsearch, and then we're going to cripple the software, or we're going to sell you enterprise support contracts. And that's not very fun. Like, I don't know if anybody here does consulting, but it's not my idea of, like, a fun business where I'm just doing other people's work and it's just not building anything on my own. So the way we approach this is we said, okay, we'll do the on-premise offering, but we're not going to give you anything. We'll let you, like, we'll answer the phone if you call us, and that's it. We're not going to do any custom code. We're not going to do consulting or services, and we're not going to manage servers for you. It's like, if you want anything at all, like, you deal with it, and we'll just, like, we'll answer questions. And then you get all the benefits of the cloud, which is, most importantly, like, it makes it cheap for people. Like, I can't give numbers, but some of our customers who are very big, who run it themselves, they spend a ridiculous amount of money for large infrastructures. Whereas, like, we run this kind of, like, singular large infrastructure, and it makes it super cheap for everybody. And then you have all, like, the classic examples of why the cloud is the right way, and it's like version updates are honestly the most important. Like, if you've ever run, like, on-premise software and, like, you're constantly having to upgrade it, and we release a new version of ours every single month. So you can imagine, like, you're going in every single month and you're having to install the new Sentry server. You're having to run all these, like, complex database migrations. And it's kind of like, it's not very fun and it's a waste of time. Like, it's not anybody's job to do this. Or rather, it shouldn't be anybody's job. So we think this is the future. And I think, like, when people ask about, like, monetizing open source, I'm just like, I don't know, if you can find a way to make it like a software as a service, a cloud offering, that's, like, absolutely the way to go. But, like, the secret is also it's not all open source. So we make, like, strategic decisions on what is and what isn't open source, but we do it in a way that's, like, respectful of what the goal is. Like, the product should be great, and you shouldn't get, like, a worse experience. So Sentry, fundamentally Sentry, the code base, Sentry, the product, is 100% open source. And that means, like, if you go to GitHub, go to git-sentry/Sentry, that's literally what we're running on Sentry.io. We run master, we ship it every single day. And what's proprietary is things that you don't need. It's like our billing infrastructure. It's our analytics to do, like, business operations. It's our operations infrastructure. And it's interesting because if you think about this, at the end of the day, all we are doing is taking our open source product and we're selling infrastructure. Like, we're almost like an AWS for Sentry. It's like, you pay us and we're going to run Sentry for you. That's all the SaaS service is. But, like, this is actually super important for us because this allows us, like, the worst conversation I ever had was, like, when we were doing fundraising, I had to explain to VCs how we can protect ourselves as open source. And I'm like, nobody's going to try to, like, make Sentry2.com because, like, the open source community would not allow it. But that doesn't, like, click in their brains. And so, of course, we have, like, trademarks, and that's why, like, some of this is closed source. And it's interesting because, like, a few months, maybe a year ago, actually, I don't even remember, we actually discovered exactly what we didn't want to see. And we found a Chinese website that had literally taken everything, like all of our marketing material, translated it, and published it. They don't have any billing code, so I don't think they have any way to charge money. I don't even know if it actually works. But it was like, it was kind of infuriating. And there's, like, as a US and European company, there's, like, literally nothing we can do about this. Like, we can't send, like, a cease and desist. Like, we can't protect ourselves at all. Whereas like if they operate in the European Union or America, we have trademarks, we have all of these other protections that we can deal with. Fortunately, this isn't like a real concern, but it's like one of those things we think about, like what if all of a sudden Amazon decided to run Sentry for customers? It would like not be a great day for us. Okay, so jumping forward, modern Sentry. And this is like, for me, this is like a little bit of like a life journey story. So I love building software. It's the greatest thing ever. I barely get to do it now. It's kind of infuriating, and whenever I do it, I get like worse and worse at it. And this is like the transition of like software engineer to CEO. I had no idea what CEO meant a couple years ago. I'm still not sure I know. But so far what I've seen is it means I spend a lot of time in meetings. And the meetings are like, I'm just going to sit here and listen to you talk about something that I'm not overly interested in. Or it's like meetings with customers or meetings with like people who want to be affiliated, like partnerships and things like this. And if anybody works at a company that like your calendar is like full of these like repetitive meetings, you know what I'm talking about. Now the good side, so this is like not overly fun to do, but the good side is like I actually spend like about half my time hiring. So like the greatest lesson I've learned as like taking this job is like my job is literally just to hire really good people. And that's like, we're constantly like recruiting people, and that's going through and like finding the right people that can actually like do everything better than me, and I don't have to worry about what they're doing. And it's also like training them. Like I think we spent a good 6 months last year just training people in the company because of like the fast growth. But it's like a really interesting thing because like you go from like building software to like building people, which, you know, isn't necessarily what I thought would be fun, and I don't necessarily think it is today. But it was like an interesting like learning experience for me. And to give you an idea of like what that meant is in 2015, we went from, I guess, myself and my co-founder to 8 people, which isn't that big of a deal, but it's still pretty good growth. And then the next year we tripled that, which is a lot harder to do. But it was like very interesting as an experience for a company. And fortunately, like a lot of the early team, like if we go back, like most of these people I've worked with in the past or tried very hard to get to work with me. So it was like, part of it was empowering that we could like bring together people that we really wanted to work with because we had like this fortunate situation. And we all were like kind of like-minded. I remember talking to Armin and I'm like, what if we just like could build open source and make money on it and then just go from there? And I don't think we knew what that meant when we were talking about that, but it was like an interesting idea. Like, what if we could just do things the way we think is right? And then the last thing is I just spent a lot of time thinking about things, which is like the worst thing in the world. It just means you spend a lot of time overthinking things, which has made me like have to like do a lot of focusing. And I actually think this is the best lesson I've had, and this applies to like everything. So the greatest example I have of this is like, if you look at our product, we have the open source and SaaS. Focus for us is like scrap on premise, sorry. So we made a big statement. We said we're building open source SaaS, like an open source cloud solution. Like you can still run the open source thing if you want, but like we're not going to build features that are specifically targeting you running it behind your firewall because we think the cloud is the right way to go. And this just means we can focus on building a product versus building, I don't know, some kind of infrastructure-y thing that like you need to be able to install. The next thing that like, you know, focus is on, like, I think software engineers are generally good at tactical decisions. Like you have a problem that needs solved, come to like an engineer and they can be like, okay, I can do this in like the next week or two. I can figure out how to solve this, right? But like for me, the big shift has been like, how do we think like a year out or 2 years out, which I'm not able to do, to be clear, but like it's like an interesting challenge. Like what's going to be the big bet you make? Like I have a really hard time reasoning about that in software. Like if you ask us what we're doing in Sentry's product, no matter what we say is not going to be what we do a year from now. We think a lot about like the competitive landscape. Like this used to be like, what about companies like Crashlytics or Fabric, or companies that are literally just doing what we're doing? And now it's more like, what if Amazon launches like a Sentry competitor, or Microsoft or Google, which has been like a very interesting dynamic that I think we wouldn't have cared about except after raising VC money. And I think the biggest thing from an engineer's point of view is like, I think a lot more about the what now instead of the how. Like, which is really hard. Like you're building any kind of system and you really like care deeply about how it's structured, like how the APIs look, or like what the schema is going to be, or like how we're going to go about testing this software. And it's like you basically have to force yourself to ignore all that, which maybe that's good in general, but it's been like a big shift. And like on that same note, like it's like I need to stop being the one to solve problems. So like good example of this is we launched this new billing model recently, and we didn't really have anybody to work on it, and it's super critical code, very complex code. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'll take that project. I have enough free time. I can like build the billing system. And that was like 5 weeks of me literally doing nothing else that I needed to do. And it was just like overwhelming. Whereas what we should have done is we should have said like 3 other people in the company, you should own this. You'll be better at it. You'll be able to solve it better. And I think that's also like really hard, especially when we're building like a software, like a big like engineering project. And it's like fundamentally like you're an engineer and you're going from what I think is the most important thing is like how do you think about the product versus how do you think about the company? So this was like the big end game question for me is like instead of thinking about what kind of product we want to build, it's like what kind of company do we want to build? And those are things like, you know, we want to build an open source company. We want to build one where we're like not cold calling people. We don't care about webinars. We literally just want to like build great software that's really useful to ourselves and thus everybody else. And I think that's been like the biggest lesson out of this for me. Cool. And that's kind of it. Like I think I'm good on time. So I'd love to take questions. You can also like harass me afterwards if you're afraid of talking in front of people.
Thank you, Dave.